Welcome. As I noted just a moment before, I'm Alice Madden. I'm the Executive Director of the Getches Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment here at Colorado Law. This year, we're actually celebrating the center's 40th anniversary. So we are so pleased to have you. As we start tonight, I want to thank the Weiss Foundation. The Weiss Foundation has an incredibly generous scholarship with tuition payback, and it also includes an education stipend. And John Z. Wilkinson, who you'll be hearing from, is one of our panelists. She's a rising 3L. She is the current Weiss Scholar, goes to excellent students who are interested in land conservation. And she has graciously given some of those funds to help produce tonight's event. We run on soft money, so everything we do, we raise the money for. So thank you, John Z, and let's wish her well in her year as the scholar. So you're going to hear a lovely introduction from Charles Wilkinson about John Leshy, and Mark Squilacci will be introducing the panelists, but I want to take a moment to thank them myself. John, having you launch your book here is a huge honor for us. We really want to thank you for choosing us. You've been a friend to the law school and those here for a long, long time. Our panelists have actually already read the book, so I want to thank them for their generosity of time and their preparation, and what I know will be a really lively discussion. So to our guests in the courtroom and the 200 watching online, let's take tonight's lessons and out into the world and act on them. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Charles Wilkinson. Trying to shorten Charles' bio is pretty much next to impossible, but I will try. And for someone who is allegedly emeritus, I have seen no evidence that anything has changed, but here goes. Charles is the Moses Lasky Professor of Law Emeritus at Colorado Law. He's just one of 25 people who's been named a distinguished professor on the CU Boulder campus. After graduating from Stanford Law School and practicing with Phoenix and San Francisco law firms, Charles joined the Native American Rights Fund, or NARF, in 1971 as a staff attorney. He then went to Oregon Law, and good for us and too bad for them. He joined us in about 1987, I think, after visiting for a couple of years, but he's been here ever since. And some of you know this. I've actually seen a couple people who went on this. Charles created a life-changing, place-based, experiential learning, advanced natural resources course that I did a really, really long time ago. And he takes students to places like the Pacific Northwest, the Colorado Plateau, Four Corners region, and the greater Yellowstone area, which I got to go to with Don Brown. I know he's here in 19... In addition to Charles's 14 books, there is another one forthcoming he is working on. I counted 8 additional pages of his publications on his official CV, 5 pages of keynote addresses, and multitudes of honors and recognitions. He's taken part in many special projects over the years with the Department of Justice, Department of Agriculture, Department of Interior. And in Interior, he participated in creating Escalante Grand Staircase. And more recently, he was counsel to the 5 Tribe Coalition on the Bears Ears National Monument. So he does all this with grace, humility, and a lot of humor, which is good. So Charles, take it over, my friend.
Good evening. The Getches Wilkinson Center is proud to have brought John Leshy out to Boulder many times. John is a treasure and nothing short of it. This is going to be a great evening. Over the past 50+ years, John has taken on numerous assignments for presidents, Congress, federal agencies, state agencies, tribes, and public interest groups. He's written many books and articles about the federal public lands. Most notably, he served as solicitor for Secretary Bruce Babbitt from 1993 through 2001. I know that I will get a lot of nods in this room when I say that John knows more about public lands law and history than anyone in the country. His book, Our Common Ground, which brings us here, is long, but it is a comfortable, enjoyable, and humorous general audience book. John loves the public lands and brings in memorable people and events into his book. He tells stories. To date, there have been so many works addressing specific subjects involving the public lands, but no one had ever written a single narrative about the public lands, such an important and fascinating institution. We now have Our Common Ground, a comprehensive book, a great book, treating public land history in a full, single narrative. This truly is the story of the public lands. Tonight, we will hear from John and a panel chaired by Mark Squillace, and we'll have good discussions. This book is just plain informative and useful. Also, Our Common Ground presents perspectives and ideas, some of which are new, challenging, and at first counterintuitive. John takes on myths, as he calls them, about the public lands, even though all or aspects of that have sometimes been thought of as reality. As an example, John wrote, no, thanks. He wrote, for more than a century, the arc of public land history has bent toward obtaining more and more federal public lands for recreation, sacredness, and beauty. For example, I know this has happened to most of you. I got here and a half an hour early, and left my talk back at home. Now I have the third page. So I hope you will apologize. So he wrote, for more than a century, the arc of public land history has bent decisively toward the national government conserving more and more lands for conservation, public education, and inspiration. That's a strong sentiment, and there are others. Many people, including experts, who read this book may at first be taken aback by the daring, expansive nature of John's findings. The more I read, And I was at first skeptical. But the more I read, the more I realized how powerful and accurate his fully documented assessments are. My expectation is that our common ground will itself become an institution. It will open up the history, current status, and future of the public lands to discussions and debate as never before. This masterful volume will have staying power, and we can expect it to be influential and constructive for generations to come. And the very words, our common ground, will become even more uplifting and profound. John.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Alice. This, of course, is really a homecoming for me because I participated in so many great events here, and it's just wonderful to be back. And we go back many years. I was trading stories with Mark Squillace. I think I helped hire him into the Interior Department. I won't give the date and embarrass us both, but it was quite a while ago. And I'm especially delighted to be here to talk about my favorite subject. As Charles said, one I've more or less devoted my professional career to. Most people know something about the public lands, often through occasional headline-grabbing controversies, like in 2017 when President Trump downsized the two large areas in southern Utah protected as national monuments. But what most people really have no idea how the breadth of these lands. More than 600 million acres, almost a third of the land in the country, 4 times the size of France. They're generally held open to all and managed primarily, as Charles said, for conservation, recreation, and education. They are, to my way of thinking, one of America's truly great institutions. Now, their reach surprises many because, our culture has always celebrated private property and distrusted government, particularly the national government. So, when I talk about this stuff, and the reaction is typically, I had no idea, how did that happen? And so I decided I needed to write a book to explain how it happened. That's what I'm trying to do here. It didn't, of course, just happen. It came about because of a long series of decisions made by our representatives in government, political decisions. What those political decisions were and how they came about and came to be made are the core of my book. Now, I'm a little intimidated, frankly, to be talking about this stuff with Charles Wilkinson and Patty Limerick in the audience, but I'll charge ahead nevertheless. The core of the story I tell begins around 1890, because it was really then when Congress began in a serious way to make key decisions to hold and safeguard the public lands in public hands, mostly for these broad conservation purposes. This was after, by the way, as many of you know, usually long after the United States acquired title to these lands from foreign governments and from native nations. The acquisition from native nations began with the first invasion of settlers from Europe, obviously not long after Columbus discovered America, as they say, long before the United States existed. The US government, once established, continued that process of acquisition of title from native nations and from foreign governments. The Native Americans lost title to large amounts of land, usually through a sequence of events that, beginning when they were dispossessed by a variety of means, including duress and chicanery, and sometimes violence, by an evolving cast of characters, settlers, miners, speculators, and others, often backed by the military force of the European nations and their successor, the United States. Acquisition of formal title came through arrangements that, while usually providing the Native Americans some compensation, wouldn't obviously never fully make up for the injustices perpetrated or the enormity of their loss. I don't address the acquisition of title from indigenous peoples or from European nations in my book. in any detail, because that process was generally completed well before the United States began making these political decisions, as I said, beginning around 1890, to hold on to significant amounts of land. And that story has also been the subject, obviously, of many books. In the latter part of my book, though, I do discuss numerous efforts by tribes in modern times to gain greater influence over public lands to which they have ancestral ties, efforts which have had considerable success. Now, what I'm going to do today is outline the major themes that emerge from our common ground and offer then some thoughts about what may lie ahead. These major themes, as Charles said, demolish, I think, some common fictions that have grown up around these lands. The first and most notorious myth is that the public lands have generally been a divisive force in American politics. I argue that just the opposite has been true. From the nation's very beginning, the public lands have tended to unite rather than divide the American polity. Here are just two examples I lay out in the book. One, my book opens with the story of a bitter dispute that for years thwarted the very formation of the United States government after the Declaration of Independence. It erupted when colonies, former colonies like Virginia and New York had claims to vast amounts of territory across the Appalachians. 7 states had Western claims. 6 of the former colonies didn't. They had fixed Western boundaries, Maryland, Pennsylvania. And there was this huge fight between the haves and the have-nots because the states without Western land claims naturally feared they were going to be dominated by the states that had claims to all this land across the Appalachians. And so the states without them refused to ratify the first organizing government of the United States until this issue was settled. So while the Revolutionary War was going on, the United States government was without a formal structure because of this stalemate. It went on for years, and then finally there was a compromise. And the compromise eventually resulted in the states with the Western land claims giving them up in the interest of holding the nation together. And the claims were given to the United States, the new national government. Those were the first public lands. And the idea was these lands would be held and would be used to keep the nation together as the Euro-American settlement expanded across the continent. And that's exactly what happened. The gifts of these lands in the early part of the country's history were instrumental, for example, in creating a system of public education that most states didn't have. The land grants that were made by the national government to new states on the admission to the Union were conditioned on using them to produce revenues to support a public school system, including eventually a higher education system, the so-called land grant colleges, and in building infrastructure like canals and railroads. Now, a second example of how the public lands helped unify the nation came in the 1880s when railroad and mining interests and assorted speculators sought to dismember what was the world's first national park at Yellowstone. Congress had established it in 1872. In the face of this threat, 2 former Civil War adversaries, a Union Army general, Phil Sheridan, and a former Confederate official who had become a US Senator from Missouri, joined forces over a period of several years to preserve the park intact for all to enjoy. Last August, Yellowstone Park attracted more than 1 million visitors in a single month, the first time in history that has happened. The second myth is that the public lands have tended to divide Americans along partisan lines. You know, we think today of every public policy issue as red, blue, Republican, Democrat. You know, we're just sort of used to thinking in sort of those, viewing political life through that lens. But as my book shows, a dominant recurring theme of public lands political history since the Civil War is how politicians have time and time again joined hands, regardless of political party, to hold and protect more and more lands in US ownership. Over this time, the vast majority of Americans of all persuasions have come to agree of the importance of holding these lands so that all may have opportunities to be inspired by and learn from their rich cultural and scientific resources. My book provides many examples of this. Most of you probably have some familiarity with the stellar contributions of the 2 President Roosevelts, one a Republican, Theodore, and one a Democrat, Franklin, who were powerful forces in the evolution of public lands. But my book brings deserved attention to many more obscure players you never heard of who had huge impact. One of my favorites is a guy named Fred Seaton. Nobody's ever heard of Fred Seaton. He was a Republican senator from Kansas before Dwight Eisenhower named him to be Interior Secretary in the late 1950s. Well, he went on to put 11 million acres of land in Alaska into national wildlife refuges, including the iconic Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So hats off to Fred Seaton. Now, the third myth is that these decisions to hold and protect more lands have been mostly a land grab by the national government over local opposition. This claim, of course, was on full display back in 2016, I think it was, when armed extremists took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Oregon for several days, claiming they were taking the lands back. That was the cry. Now, in that particular case, it was really sheer fantasy because the United States had purchased those lands in that refuge in the 1930s from a very willing seller, a meatpacking company that was about to go belly up and wanted to get somebody like the government to take the lands off their hands. So not taking the land back. But more generally, as my book shows, grassroots support played a key role in the establishment of much of the protected public lands we see today. This can be illustrated by taking a quick look at how the National Forest System was put together, largely between 1891 and 1909. That was a pivotal episode in public land history. Congress set it in motion in early 1891 when it gave the president the power to, quote, set apart and reserve in any state or territory public lands as public reservations, putting them off limits to the many laws that were then on the books allowing their transfer out of federal ownership, like the railroad grant laws and the mining law and the Homestead Act. The 1891 Act culminated a campaign that had begun about 15 years earlier that has several roots. One was the increasing awareness that the traditional federal public land policy of fostering Euro-American settlement by granting public land to promote farming, that's the homestead idea, that wouldn't work once you hit the more rugged and arid parts of the West. Most Westerners supported the idea of keeping lands in the upper reaches of those arid watersheds in public ownership, especially to safeguard water resources. Even then, by the way, the arid West was the country's most urban region. Something that people are often shocked to hear. Denver had a population of 5,000 in 1860. By 1890, its population was 100,000. Largely an urban state, as were most of the Western states, and still are the most urban region in the country. Another was the growing belief that the national government needed to take steps to curb what was by then the well-known appetite of large industrial enterprises like railroad, mining, logging, and livestock companies from taking control of vast amounts of land for private profit and pushing common folk aside. There was an influential evangelist for that position, I talk about a little in the book, named Henry George, who had spent several years in the West, grew up in the West, really. And he wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, which outsold every book in the latter part of the 19th century in the United States, other than the Bible. And his warning that the public lands not suitable for farming would be likely to fall into the hands of a few. That reverberated with a populace dissatisfied with what they then saw was sort of garish corruption and extreme wealth inequalities that marked the age that Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. I wrote a book about it. And then there was the idea that the Congress had already put into effect at Yosemite in 1864 and Yellowstone in 1872, that government preservation of iconic landscapes for public inspiration and enjoyment could, by nurturing national public unity and pride shattered by the Civil War, could help heal the nation. Now, what happened next showed how deeply public land reservations reflected the mainstream opinion in the West as well as nationally. Within 4 weeks of President getting that authority in 1891, he reserved 1 million acres of public land in Wyoming. The next day, he appointed a Montana congressman named Thomas Carter to head the General Land Office, which was then the agency of the government that managed all the public lands or looked after the public lands. Carter was politically ambitious, by the way. He would later represent Montana 2 terms in the US Senate. He was the first Westerner to head the GLO, the General Land Office. He promptly directed his staff to launch a systematic inventory looking to, quote, reserve all public lands in mountainous and other regions that produce water flow for use of communities and settlements downstream. Yes, he said reserve all public lands of that character. In 1891, October of 1891, Harrison established another reservation, what's now called the White River National Forest, on more than 1 million acres of land west of here. Today, that forest, by the way, attracts more visitors than any other national forest in the nation. Local response to this in Colorado and elsewhere was very positive. A memorial from the Colorado State Forestry Association, signed by several state officials, the Chambers of Commerce of Denver and Colorado Springs, and 500 leading citizens petitioned the government to reserve, quote, all public lands along 6 miles either side of the crest of the mountain ranges across the entire state. In 1892, Harrison reserved 3 other reserves in Colorado, including around Pikes Peak. Following a visit to that reserve, the following year, Catherine Lee Bates was inspired to write of Purple Mountain Majesties in her stirring composition, America the Beautiful. Now, before Harrison left office in March 1893, he had created more than 15 reserves covering more than 13 million acres in 5 western states and 3 territories. He was defeated for re-election in 1892, but believe me, his reservation policy had nothing to do with it. Because in fact, in that election, Coloradans awarded their electoral votes to James Weaver, the populist candidate who ran to the left of Cleveland and Harrison in seeking to curb the influence of big business on national policy. Now, the next several presidents, Republican and Democrat, continued to vigorously exercise this reservation authority, setting aside most of what we now know as the national forest system in the western part of the country, the green areas there in the west. With a couple of relatively minor exceptions, Congress went along without complaint. Now, one of the little hiccups in the process that's gotten a lot of attention from historians involved an obscure one-term congressman, a senator from Oregon named Charles Fulton. In March 1907, he convinced himself that Theodore Roosevelt was threatening to use this reservation authority to lock up lands that were suitable for farming. So he attached a rider to a kind of important must-pass sort of agricultural funding bill that forbade the president from putting any additional public lands into reservations in 6 states, including Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, without Congress's approval. But his amendment left existing reservations in those states already created undisturbed. Now, it's a famous episode, before Roosevelt signed that bill into law, he signed proclamations putting 16 million more acres into reservations in those 6 states named in Fulton's rider. Now, in taking that seemingly bold step, Roosevelt was making a shrewd political calculation. As he himself told Congress the previous year, quote, "The forest reserve policy can be successful only when it has the full support of the people in the West, because the people who live in the neighborhood of these reserves will ultimately determine whether or not they are to be permanent." Now, as my book recounts, Roosevelt's political instincts were, as usual, excellent. Shortly after he acted, the governor of Colorado called a public lands convention to discuss what Roosevelt had just done and to consider what to do about it. That convention was dominated by livestock interests from Wyoming and Colorado. It adjourned without calling for any action whatsoever with respect to the Roosevelt reserves. As a matter of fact, far from setting back the movement to safeguard more public lands and national ownership, the events of early 1907 significantly advanced it. Neither these Roosevelt reserves nor many more reserves that he established in the other states outside of those 6 in his remaining time of office, there was never any serious effort to undo them. Indeed, not long after, I dug out this obscure fact, not long after Roosevelt acted in 1907, livestock operators in Northwest Colorado petitioned the Congress to extend the boundaries of a reserve that had been established previously to include the lands that their livestock grazed because they feared competition from itinerant cattle and sheep outfits, and so they wanted protection and they wanted more land, wanted Congress to put more land in the reserves. Now, another part of the 1907 Act, the same bill that Roosevelt signed into law, did something else. It ordered the Agriculture Department to study and recommend whether the United States ought to acquire and establish similar reserves in the rest of the country, in the Midwest, in the South, and New England. That idea, the study supported that idea, and 4 years later, in 1911, Congress passed something called the Weeks Act. And the Weeks Act launched a program of acquisition, which eventually resulted in the purchase of more than 20 million acres and the establishment of 52 forest reserves in the East, South, and Midwest. And it was entirely fitting that that same 1907 Act said that all such reserves, quote, shall hereafter be known as national forests. Whoops, let's see. In fact, far from being a land grab by a domineering national government, most of the protected lands that we see around the country, especially national parks, refuges, and forests in the East, South, and Midwest, all of those green lands and dark green lands in the eastern half of the country, almost all of them were acquired by the United States with the support of relevant states from willing seller private property owners. Indeed, some places like Everglades in Florida, I'm not sure this is working, and Big Bend in Texas, big, huge national parks. States spent state taxpayer money to buy up those lands and acquire them into public ownership, and then donated those lands to the national government so it could be protected as national parks. So hardly a land grab when you think of it in those terms. Now, my book also describes how in the early 20th century, the first national wildlife refuges were established on public lands by President Theodore Roosevelt. Congress, by the way, quickly jumped on board in that program. And then in the depths of the Great Depression, Congress launched another major new program in the middle of the country to acquire prime wildlife habitat into national ownership to reverse a sharp decline in migratory birds. Key mechanism for funding that, by the way, was the so-called duck stamp. It's kind of a hunting license, and the revenues dedicated to acquiring more lands in public ownership, all with the consent of the relevant states. It also, in the same time, in the New Deal era, launched another major acquisition program to buy homesteads that had failed in the more arid parts of the central part of the country, to buy them back into U.S. ownership to rehabilitate grasslands. Two of those, by the way, as you may know, are found in eastern Colorado, the Comanche and the Pawnee. Colorado also, of course, has several national parks. The first established in 1906, Mesa Verde, and the flagship, of course, is the Rocky Mountain National Park, established in 1915, and then in recent years, Congress has added 2 more. Now, my book also sets the facts straight on another, what I think is commonly misunderstood public land story. How in the early 1930s, the United States decided to keep some 150 million acres, and this is the Bureau of Land Management lands, the sort of orange lands. How the United States decided to keep those in national ownership. These were lands that livestock operators had grazed without legal sanction, but with the government's passive acquiescence for decades. But Dust Bowl conditions had put the industry into deep depression. Now, President Hoover came along and proposed to give those lands to the states on certain conditions. Congress responded by calling for a committee to study the idea, known as the Garfield Committee after its chair. Most of the 20 members of that committee were Republicans from the West, including a well-known Republican Party activist from Montrose, Colorado, named Charles Moynihan. The committee recommended, with no dissents, that this vast acreage be put under, quote, responsible administration or regulation for the conservation as well as beneficial use of its resources, and that the states be given the option to take over the lands under those conditions. But then consider this. Before that offer was to be extended to the states, the committee said the U.S. should reserve in national ownership all of those unreserved lands deemed important for, among other things, national forests, national parks, national monuments, migratory bird refuges, The committee emphasized the importance of protecting wilderness, used that word, wildlife, archaeological and ethnological remains, and unusual wonders of nature. Only after that review process, the committee said, would it be appropriate to offer the remaining lands to the states. And only then with significant strings attached, including that the states would have a trust responsibility to rehabilitate those lands. Now, neither the states nor the major interest groups could unite on how to respond to this committee recommendation. So it went nowhere in the Congress. And at that point, Congressman Edward Taylor of Colorado stepped in. And he built on a proposal that was a Democrat. He built on a proposal crafted in the preceding Congress by a representative from Utah named Don Colton, a Republican. And the recommendation resulted in the enactment of what we now know as the Taylor Grazing Act, to control livestock grazing on these lands and rehabilitate them and stabilize the floundering livestock industry. Taylor had represented Colorado in the House since 1909, and his evolution on this issue is quite instructive. While in his first term, he called the Weeks Act, that act that launched the National Forest of the East, he called the Weeks Act an outrage. And he condemned as, quote, un-American, the idea that the United States should hold large amounts of public lands in the West. But he gradually changed his mind in the 1920s as the farming and ranching industries fell into deep depression with the Dust Bowl. In his words, the overuse and abuse of these lands threatened, he said, the basic economy of entire communities. And so he pursued reform with, as historian Louise Peffer put it, with the zeal of a convert. Enacted with strong bipartisan support, the Taylor Grazing Act assigned this task to the Interior Department. Eventually, in 1946, the Bureau of Land Management carried forward its implementation. I spent a little time on that episode because the events and the Garfield Committee's recommendation brought considerable attention to the fact that these previously unreserved lands contain many places worthy of special protection, because popular interest in protecting scenery and recreational opportunities and wildlife habitat, et cetera, had not slackened in the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover himself, by the way, who was an avid angler, had protected large amounts of formerly unreserved public lands in this era at places like Great Sand Dunes and Black Canyon of the Gunnison in Colorado, and White Sands in New Mexico and Death Valley in California, using its power under the Antiquities Act of 1906, where Congress had given the power to create national monuments. Now, over succeeding decades, as the appreciation of the values of these formerly unreserved lands grew, the United States would put many millions more of these acres in protected status with names like Bears Ears, Cascade Siskiyou, Chiricahua, Grand Canyon Parashant, Grand Staircase Escalante, Joshua Tree, King Range, Missouri Breaks, Red Rock Canyon, on and on. Now, there's a fourth myth about public lands history, and that is that most decisions to conserve lands in US ownership have been made by executive fiat, by people like Theodore Roosevelt, over the opposition of people in Congress. The facts are mostly otherwise, because Congress not only gave the executive power, broad powers in this area, but almost always subsequently approved how executives exercise that power. And then in the 1960s, and this is another chapter, the Congress began carving back, claiming back, reclaiming the authority that it had given the executive to decide what kinds of uses would be allowed on particular tracts of public land. And the engineer of this was Wayne Aspinall from Western Slope of Colorado, Democrat. His first big success on this point was the Wilderness Act of 1964. Now, don't get me wrong. Wayne Aspinall was not a big fan of the Wilderness Act, or that is, of protecting public lands as wilderness, but he felt very, very strongly that Congress should make those decisions. The Wilderness Act is probably the most protective category of public lands. Detailed instructions written into the statute on how the lands, what would be permitted and what not. So no logging, no mining, no roads, no motorized vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. Aspinall, not a fan of wilderness, but more important to him was the idea it has to be a congressional decision. And so he insisted Congress be the gatekeeper in the system. Not a single acre is in the National Wilderness System unless Congress has passed a law to put it there. Now, this, by the way, has had a very significant, if not very well appreciated, effect on public land policy because it's enhanced the influence of local representatives in the Congress over those decisions. Because if you've paid any attention to Congress, you know there's a powerful, long-standing custom that gives members of Congress an effective veto over legislation that particularly applies in their districts. And so you can't get an acre into the wilderness system if the local congressional delegation is opposed. Now, Aspinall seriously underestimated the support that would develop at the grassroots for limiting these industrial uses on public lands. And the result is obvious. Congress has enacted many dozens of individual pieces of legislation that have together put more than 100 million acres of public land in the wilderness system. This has been a decidedly bipartisan enterprise, by the way. The big jump, of course, is ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act in 1980, which tripled the size of the wilderness system overnight. But ignore the big jump for a moment and look at the rest of the arc. It's always up. It's steadily up. It's steadily up. Through Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, Republican-controlled Congresses, Democratic-controlled Congresses. More than half of the 54 million acres in the wilderness system outside of Alaska were the result of acts of Congress signed into law by Republican presidents. More than a quarter moved through Congresses where Republicans were in control of at least one chamber. Now, beginning around the same time, the 1960s, Congress enacted numerous other statutes that did what Wayne Aspinall wanted, which is dictate how particular areas of public lands would be used. Many of these acts contain labels like National Recreation Area, National Conservation Area, National Preserve. Each one writing into the statute management prescriptions, Congress making the decisions how those lands would be managed. Pretty much on the Wilderness Act model, a little less strict and a little more variable, but they all make conservation and recreation the primary objectives of management. And they limit agency discretion by ruling out or strongly discouraging things like road building, mining, timber harvesting, and the like. And besides adding protections, they bring more visibility to these areas, these labels. Congress provides Colorado provides an excellent example of this. You really can't see much on this except you see all the colors, and you see the darker the colors are in wilderness areas managed by the various agencies and all of that. Congress established the first national recreation area in 1964. There are now more than 36 around the country, including 2 in Colorado. It established the first national conservation area in 1970. There are now 17, including 3 managed by the BLM in Colorado. Congress established the first 2 national preserves in 1974. There are now nearly 24, including Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve in Colorado. Beginning in the 60s, Congress also established more than a dozen national seashores and lake shores, and the Wild and Scenic Rivers system on the Wilderness Act model. Colorado so far only has 1 segment in the Wild and Scenic River system. I'm not sure why that is, but actually I have a theory, but we can talk about that later. In doing all this, by the way, it's important to note Congress did not discriminate among the agencies. There are 4 principal federal land management agencies, and each one of them manages millions of acres of wilderness and manages national recreation areas and national conservation areas and the like. So the historic distinctions among these agencies has been substantially blurred by this modern exercise. And this has in turn elevated, I think, in a real way, but unquantifiable way, public consciousness of the idea that regardless of which agency is in charge, public lands are generally managed for open space conservation and recreation more than anything else. Now, Congress's reclaiming of authority over public lands has also operated to enhance the durability of these protections because Congress almost never reverses itself. Once an area is put into protected status, Congress at most will add protections or enlarge the area, but will almost never go backwards. And that's why, again, these arcs go continually upward. It's almost unheard of for Congress even to weaken protections put in place, much less rescind them. Now, one of the most important developments in this era, it concerns one particular agency, the Bureau of Land Management. Because, as my book put it, the Bureau of Land Management was long derided as the Bureau of Livestock and Mining because that's what people thought it did all the time. But with the strong bipartisan encouragement by Congress, Bureau of Land Management's mission is now substantially conservation, like the other agencies, protection of cultural resources, recreation, etc. This is captured, by the way, in the change in the logo. The original logo of the Bureau of Land Management had your miner, logger, surveyor, blah, blah, blah. And then in '64, it changed to what's on the right. It's also important to note that as these developments were unfolding in the 60s and 70s, while Congress then was in Democratic control, Republicans played a substantial role in this process. One of the major architects of the Wilderness Act of '64, for example, was a congressman from a blue-collar district in Pennsylvania named John Saylor. And his name is all over the history of this era as a very strong protection advocate. And almost all of that legislation had strong bipartisan support. I think there were something like 12 votes against the Wilderness Act in the entire Congress. And Republican presidents Nixon and Ford were generally as supportive as their Democratic counterparts. Now, Ronald Reagan's rise in the late 1970s marked a growing polarization of the body politic on many issues. But it did not significantly affect the overall direction of public land policy. And this can be shown by a very quick tour of presidential administrations, beginning with Carter's. It was during the Carter administration that the so-called Sagebrush Rebellion erupted, promoted primarily by federal grazing permittees who were unhappy with the direction of federal policy. And it took the form of legislation adopted by a handful of Western states that actually made a formal legal claim of state ownership of land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Now, the rebellion quickly faded, such as it was. The states that enacted the legislation never tried to litigate their claim in court, nor take any other concrete step to enforce it. Congress never took it seriously, neither did the executive branch, and neither did the American people, including the people in the very states that had passed these laws of these acts of rebellion. Underneath that blast of hot air, the long tradition of bipartisan consensus supporting more protection for more public lands endured. That bipartisan consensus easily survived a hiccup in the early years of the Reagan administration when he was persuaded by some libertarian economists to propose selling off some 35 million acres of, quote, surplus public land to help balance the federal budget. The idea triggered a lot of grassroots opposition and found no support in the Congress among Republicans or Democrats. Reagan, a masterful politician, got the lesson, moved quickly to the center on public lands issues, and worked with Congress to follow the well-worn path to protect more public lands. This is the, again, the wilderness system, the big spike with Anoka, and notice the next big spike there. That was the Reagan era. In 1984, with the Senate in Republican control, Reagan signed legislation adding more than 8 million acres to the wilderness system, the largest addition in any single year since the Wilderness Act was enacted, except for the special case of Alaska. And before he left office, Reagan signed legislation putting more acreage in the lower 48 states in the wilderness system than any president before or since. Now, in 1985, the then governor of Arizona, Bruce Babbitt, for whom I had the pleasure of working in the Clinton administration, when he was Interior Secretary, gave a speech in which he nicely captured what was happening. The last few years, he said, this is 1985, would be remembered as a time when public land protection advocates broadened their base, sharpened their message, and mounted a strong grassroots campaign to replace the idea of multiple use. And that multiple use was the sort of well-worn catchphrase that was used to suggest that public lands were fully open to logging and mining and other forms of intensive development. to replace that with the idea of public use. What Babbitt said was, public use recognizes the new reality that the highest, best, and most productive use of Western public land will usually be for public purposes like protecting watersheds, wildlife, and recreation. Babbitt had it right, and the Republicans got the message. Today, in fact, industrial uses like mining, drilling, and large-scale commercial logging take place on a relatively small proportion of Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service lands. And that pattern has held through subsequent administrations. For example, 1994, the contract with America. Newt Gingrich leads the Republicans to snatch control of the House. The contract with America bristled with anti-government rhetoric, but was utterly silent on public lands. This is not really a surprise. The people who put the contract with America together poll tested everything in it extensively. And the principal drafter of the contract with America, messaging guru in the Republican Party named Frank Luntz, put the matter bluntly in a later memo. He advised the GOP to avoid making head-on challenges to what he called, quote, the most popular federal programs today, conservation of public lands and waters through parks and open spaces. Pattern continued on and on through the Clinton administration, through the Bush administration, and through the Obama administration. But what, you might say, about the Trump administration? Now, certainly Trump made a big splash with the severe downsizing of those 2 national monuments in Utah that Presidents Clinton and Obama had established on more than 3 million acres, the Bears Ears being the most prominent. He's signing the Bears Ears Proclamation on the right. It also made numerous efforts, obviously, to bend public land policy away from conservation and toward industrial exploitation, especially by the fossil fuel industry. But considered as a whole, and I know this will be controversial, I would argue that Donald Trump correctly grasped what most Republicans in the West as elsewhere, that they did not support transferring public lands to states or the private sector, nor stripping protections away from them. Now consider these facts. This is one of my favorite moments in the last few years. The campaign for the Republican nomination in 2016. Nevada Republican caucuses, February 2016. Trump's rival Ted Cruz was calling it, quote, ridiculous not to give full control of Nevada's public lands to their rightful owners, its citizens. Shortly after, Trump gave a well-publicized interview with Field and Stream magazine, in which he opposed selling off public lands or giving them to the states, and instead argued that the U.S. should, in his words, continue to be great stewards of these magnificent lands. In the Nevada caucuses, by the way, he got more than twice as many delegates as any other candidate, and Ted Cruz finished third. When the Republican Platform Committee that same year, 2016, promoted a plank calling for possible divestiture of some public lands, it's kind of a dog whistle to the far right. A Montana Republican congressman named Ryan Zinke, who was a member of the Platform Committee, resigned in public protest to that plank. This apparently so endeared him to the Trump campaign that once elected, Trump made him Interior Secretary, and the Republican Congress Senate quickly confirmed him. Most important, before President Trump left office, he signed into law 2 major pieces of bipartisan public land protection legislation. The first in 2019 was a so-called Omnibus Public Land Protection Act. It added more than 1 million acres in several states to the wilderness system and expanded national park system units. Its most noteworthy piece, interestingly, added protections to nearly 1 million acres of public lands in southern Utah, a piece that was crafted by the all-Republican Utah congressional delegation, not long after Trump had reduced the nearby Bears Ears National Monument. Another component of that 2019 bill ended Congress's practice of putting an expiration date on something called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That fund was established by Congress in 1964 to provide a stream of money derived primarily from oil and gas revenues for federal, state, and local governments to buy more land for conservation and recreation around the country. As a result of that 2019 act, the Congress no longer has to renew the fund periodically. It's just there. The next year, 2020, Trump signed into law an even more important act, the so-called Great American Outdoors Act. It's been called the biggest public lands conservation legislation in a generation because of an even more fundamental change it made in the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Since 1964, Congress had insisted that it decide every year how much money to allocate out of that fund to purchase more land into public ownership. And the result was between 1965 and 2019, less than half of the more than $40 billion that had accrued in that fund had been expended. With strong bipartisan support in 2020 and signed into law by President Trump, Congress now made it a true revolving fund, permitting its revenues to be spent as they are accrued. This was a major, major victory for public lands everywhere. Now, as most of you no doubt know, last fall, President Biden reversed the Trump actions on the 2 Utah monuments and is restoring other public lands protections that President Trump sought to undo or weaken. At Bears Ears, a majority of the newly elected local county commissioners supported the Biden action. Despite the Democrats' very thin margins in Congress, he's not run into much opposition in his campaign to do that. So, in other words, Trump's headline-grabbing action on the Utah monuments did not really reflect a change in public opinion or significantly alter the direction of Congress's legislation. More broadly, what Congress and the executive have been doing on the public lands for more than a century has been supported by every significant public opinion poll taken over the last several decades in the West as well as elsewhere. They show large majorities of Americans across both political parties want more and better protected public lands to provide open space, recreational opportunities, and protect wildlife, watersheds, and cultural resources. They agree, in other words, that holding large amounts of public land in national ownership open to all has been extraordinarily visionary and beneficial. Because these public lands today reflect what the vast majority of the American people want, their story is really a political success story, showing the political process working as it's supposed to work, where Congress responds to and accurately reflects public opinion. Bringing more attention to political success stories is particularly important, I would argue, in our polarized era, where many are skeptical that anything good can come out of the nation's capital. It's a major reason I wrote the book, frankly. This is not creeping socialism, by the way. Everybody who lives in areas of abundant public lands know that they provide many opportunities for private enterprise. Indeed, tourism and recreational related businesses have become a major economic driver in many smaller communities around the West as well as elsewhere, making the economic contributions of traditional activities like logging and mining and livestock grazing pale in comparison. Now, let me pivot briefly to look at the major challenges that face the public lands. The biggest are the interrelated ones of climate change and biodiversity loss. They're both global problems, obviously, and both pose countless tests for public lands. A changing climate alters the natural qualities of public lands that were usually a reason the United States decided to retain or acquire them in the first place. Headline in the New York Times not long ago said, "Your children's Yellowstone will be radically different." The important reservoirs of biodiversity found on public lands are likewise threatened by what's now being called the sixth great extinction in the planet's history. These two are intimately related, obviously. Degradation of biodiversity is an important driver of climate change and vice versa. Now, the history of America's public lands, I think, can help us inform us as a society how we confront these challenges. For one thing, these public lands furnish vivid demonstrations of the effects of climate change and biodiversity loss that can help sound the alarm, arouse public opinion, and stimulate needed political action. The glaciers are supposed to disappear from Glacier National Park by 2030. Florida's Everglades and numerous other protected areas of public lands along the coast, including more than a third of the 550 national wildlife refuges, are threatened by sea level rise. Now, we know what we have to do, and the technology is rapidly advancing that facilitates it. At the most fundamental level, dealing with these challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss simply requires a frank acknowledgement that society's collective interests, especially the interests of future generations, must outweigh shorter-term, narrower interests. It's a problem of political will Now, the history of America's public lands provides, I think, time and again, examples of how our political system has done exactly that. Indeed, one could argue that the public lands represent some of the best thinking and acting in the interests of future generations that the American political system has ever produced. Now, one of the concrete ways public lands can continue to play that role is to facilitate the necessary transition to decarbonize the world's economy. Recall this wise aphorism: the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. It ended because humanity found better ways to meet its needs. In the same way, our dependence on fossil fuels for energy will not end because we have run out of fossil fuels. It will end when we collectively realize that weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels is likely the only way humanity will avert catastrophe. The public lands are already involved in that transition, as many of you probably know. Indeed, the Trump administration unwittingly provided a really dramatic illustration of this. In 2017, the administration pushed through Congress on a strict party line vote legislation the state of Alaska and oil companies had been promoting for half a century, which was to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge established by that Republican Fred Seaton back in 1960 to oil and gas development. And so in one of its final acts in January 2021, the Trump administration held a lease sale at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Well, guess what? Major oil companies stayed away, in part because they feared public and investor disapproval, and in part because the development costs in the region are really high. It's no small irony, by the way, that one of the reasons the development costs in the region are really high is because the Arctic is warming much faster than anywhere else, and the permafrost is melting, and you need frozen permafrost in order to support infrastructure for oil and gas development. Now, this lease sale was supposed to raise billions of dollars to close budget deficits in Alaska and in the United States. It raised a total of $14 million with an M, almost laughable. Most of the bids actually were submitted by an agency of the state of Alaska to kind of avoid the red face at the failure of the sale. And the same thing has happened for many other areas where the Trump administration has promoted more fossil fuel development, thwarted primarily by bipartisan opposition along the coastlines, et cetera. At the same time, there's been a huge wave of interest in using public lands as sites for wind and solar energy projects. Indeed, in stark contrast, this is the bottom here, stark contrast to what happened in the Arctic Refuge and the auction bust on the oil and gas auction, an Interior Department auction of leases offshore Long Island as sites for wind energy projects in February, just a couple of months ago, raised more than $4 billion in bids. Now, regarding the loss of biodiversity, my book contains numerous examples of how the public lands have historically helped stem that loss. Indeed, a long-standing goal of public land policy has been to rehabilitate environmental health. That Weeks Act back in 1911, I think it was America's first major environmental restoration statute, because the program it launched to buy lands into public ownership in the East and the Midwest and the South were mostly logged over lands. And the idea was the United States should buy them and reestablish healthy forests on them to reduce erosion and prevent destructive floods, et cetera. That legislation, by the way, strongly supported by Democratic governors in the South and Republican governors in the North. In fact, I put this episode in my book because I found it quite touching. These governors joined hands and testified before Congress at a hearing on the Weeks Act. And the Republican governor of Massachusetts said, you know, this is the first time in the American history where the governors from these two regions have appeared jointly before Congress to ask for something for the common welfare of the United States. Such restoration programs, by the way, it should go without saying, produce jobs as well as offset carbon emissions. In fact, overall, the public lands today comprise the great bulk of the 12% of US lands and 26% of US marine areas whose biodiversity is now generally considered protected. And they're playing a prominent role in the Biden administration's America the Beautiful program. aiming at conserving 30% of the nation's land and waters by 2030. Practically all the nations in the world, by the way, have endorsed that goal. It's fitting that the public lands play a primary role in this effort because their protection has long made the United States a world leader in this space. America's public lands have helped foster global networks of protected lands that include things like biosphere reserves that now number more than 700 in more than 120 nations, including a dozen in the United States, and World Heritage Sites that celebrate nature. And there are now more than 200 in nearly 100 nations, including 20 in the United States, mostly on public lands. Now, let me briefly address, before I close, another major challenge the public lands face, which is the so-called recreation explosion. Keep in mind that recreate means to restore or recover. And so it's no surprise in the pandemic, public land spaces were overwhelmed with people, smashing previous visitation records. It's a good thing that people want to recreate on public lands. That opportunity needs to be safeguarded for all. But it can be challenging to manage large numbers of recreational users while preserving meaningful visitors' experiences and not loving the lands to death, destroying the very qualities that attract visitors. There's good news on this front, by the way. President Trump's, the Great American Outdoors Act that he signed into law in 2020 with strong bipartisan support, took a major step to address the maintenance backlog of the 4 public land agencies. The Legacy Restoration Fund it established for that purpose has been called the largest single investment in public lands in American history. Now, before closing, let me just say a few words about President Biden's naming of Deb Haaland, a member of Congress from New Mexico, to be Interior Secretary, the first Native American to hold a cabinet post in American history. He also named Native American Bob Anderson, familiar to many of you because he's been a frequent visitor here, and a Native American to be head of the National Park Service. As I said earlier, my book discusses in some detail how, starting in the decades after World War II, Native American nations have been increasingly demanding and often succeeding in winning greater consideration of their strong connections to ancestral lands that are now in public ownership. They've worked with Congress with some success to safeguard cultural sites and correct historical injustices. And President Obama broke new ground with the help of Charles Wilkinson and others in this room to create a special intertribal commission to influence the management of the Bears Ears National Monument. The United States is also, along with many nations around the world, beginning to draw on the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples for guidance in protecting biodiversity and dealing with the challenges of climate change, using fire as a landscape management tool, and in the West, restoring salmon runs. The nation's public lands offer many opportunities for redressing past injustices and healing societal wounds. In general, Native nations and peoples strongly support protecting and restoring public land areas and values that are of particular cultural and spiritual significance to them. And I'm confident that Secretary Haaland and her team will continue to make important contributions in this area. Now, in closing, let me come back to where I started. The political process ultimately sets public land policy. Because the American people have the final word, the future of the public lands is going to be determined largely by how Americans, and especially rising generations of Americans, react to the changes now underway. Daunting questions loom. Will voters continue to support protecting public lands as a changing climate takes its toll, as biodiversity suffers, as iconic places on public lands become more crowded? What if rejecting rather than respecting the teachings of science becomes a dominant attitude? What if partisan rhetoric intensifies? What if the American political system becomes more dysfunctional? Will candidates for public office, especially in places where public lands are abundant, continue to believe that protecting these lands enhances the quality of life? The answers will determine whether the long-standing bipartisan consensus I've talked about that protecting these lands enhances the quality of life, whether that long-standing bipartisan consensus will endure or will it unravel. For public lands to have a bright future, younger, more diverse generations of people from all walks of life need to engage with them and with the political system. Good policy doesn't just happen. It happens because people advocate for it. So far, for all its imperfections, the American political system has bridged political, party, regional, and other divisions to produce a result that the American people, most Americans, strongly support. As Richard Nixon put it in 1971, public lands have given the nation breathing space, a vast public asset that supports, nurtures national pride, physical and mental health, and a spirit of community in an increasingly diverse nation. It's offered tens of millions of people life-changing encounters with nature. And as I mentioned, public lands-related tourism is the economic anchor in many communities. And it's begun, admittedly tardily, to better reflect societal diversity and to acknowledge past injustices. Although Native Americans, women, and people of color were largely excluded from the political system and most of the key political decisions that kept these lands in public ownership, that's happily no longer the case. And because these lands remain subject to the will of the electorate, a group defined more broadly than ever before, they can help redress some of the injustices of the past to again demonstrate our ability to work together as a people and find common ground. In his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, published the same year as the Declaration of Independence, the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, the champion of free market capitalism, made a strong case for private ownership of land, but for a single exception. He wrote, "A great and civilized nation ought to own and hold lands for the purpose of pleasure and magnificence for everyone's benefit." That the national government, responding to public opinion, has heeded Smith's advice is a bipartisan success story deserving of celebration, a welcome counter to the political polarization and distrust that currently plagues us. Thank you very much for inviting me and for listening.
So we're going to have a little discussion with a panel that I'm going to introduce in just a moment. First, let me just thank John for a really terrific talk. You know, it is Earth Day Eve, and it was wonderful to have such an inspiring message on this day, and we can carry this forward tomorrow and beyond. And hope for good things for our public lands. And it's just a wonderful book, John. Those of us who have managed to get through it, it's a task, but it's a wonderful, wonderful read. You write so well. And what will, I think, be important here is that it's a book that's going to be a reference book, I think, for all of us who care about public lands. So kudos for doing that. And by the way, thanks for the job that you gave me at the beginning of my career. Good. So let me just quickly introduce our panel. We'll try to keep our comments relatively short, but we do want to sort of react and also just offer a few thoughts about our own values in public lands. So I'm going to introduce folks in the order in which they're going to speak. Comments and questions. So we're going to start with Patty Limerick, who really needs no introduction, professor of history, of course, director of the Center for the American West, and someone who's just a treasure for the University of Colorado. We're so grateful to have you as part of our university, Patty, so thank you. After Patty, we're going to hear from Maria Hanley, I'm sorry. Maria is a senior director for strategic partnerships and organizing at the Wilderness Society. And after Maria is Allison Flint, former student of mine who is the senior litigation director at the Wilderness Society. And then finally, Eric Dude, another of my students. Eric was one of our WE scholars from 2019. Eric also is at the Solicitor's Office and entered the office under the honors program back in 2019 and is still with the Solicitor's Office. And so good to see you again, Eric. All right, so let me start with Pat. Oh, I missed Johnsy. Sorry about that, Johnsy. So Johnsy is another one of our WE scholars from this year. And Johnsy is also going to the Solicitor's Office next year. Is that correct, Johnsy? Yeah. Yes. I think so. So we've got a real train going, I think, in the solicitor's office, and it's great to see all of you with these really successful stories. John C's a rising 3L, I think, as was already mentioned, and is, again, one of our WE scholars. So thanks to all of you. John C's going to talk before Eric. So let me just try to get the ordering correct. I was trying to do this in the way that they were speaking, and I didn't realize you were all out of order. So go ahead, Patty. Let's hear from you.
I'll just say quickly, unfortunately, John Z and I are not.
Effective kid is a mistake. This technicality of bloodlines, how that goes. So howdy, I've been in this room so often, I feel like it's my second home or something. It's, well, anyway, this is a great pleasure. That was my way of saying thank you so much for having me here. And I want to say a few things. Well, I want to talk about the fact that we have people who gave us a great legacy who sometimes make us cringe. And there's nothing to be done about that because they're dead. So we cannot get to them and say, would you please, Theodore Roosevelt, if you would stop talking about how white women must have more babies so that they will out-reproduce dark people, would you please stop doing that? We cannot do that. It's out of our reach. And there's always just these interesting problems that John Wesley Powell wanted to dewater the streams, and he wanted to dewater the streams in a careful, methodical, watershed-oriented way, but then there wouldn't have been quite the watersheds there would have been before the streams got dewatered. So they turn out to be, regrettably, too much like us and being mixed in their character. Very irritating to have these predecessors who just go around. I don't know, they should have thought more about us and our needs for great heroes. So I actually really appreciate, like the fact that they are as they are, but I worry sometimes that okay, so I will just say what I have said in many situations, that the progressive era, creation of public lands, the rise of conservation coincides with the nadir of American race relations. Worse circumstances for the plenary power over Indian people, I won't go, but it is a legacy, and it has to be on our minds all the time. So we can certainly give up the effort to reform their flaws of character and work more on our own. We can certainly do that, but we are so chronically charged to deal with that timing of the nadir of American race relations, Jim Crow segregation. I mean, it's a bad phase. And a few of the folks took stands. And I'm just going to go quickly to this, and then I'm going to get comments, and that we'll get to questions. It's an incredible irritation to me when I have ended up having to pay more attention to the Reconstruction era in the American West. What an irritation to discover that Senator William Stewart, John Wesley Powell's antagonist, totally unthinking about the consequences for the future person and the development of mineral resources. That's all true. And a principal figure in Reconstruction at getting the 15th Amendment put together. The 15th Amendment awarded vote to Black American men. And so it was Senator Stewart who played, there were many different drafts of that thing, and it was Stewart who played a big role in bringing that together. So that pisses me off. I mean, for heaven's sake, what am I supposed to do about that? Admire William Stewart? I'm going to be with John Leshy, and I'm going to be admiring William Stewart? No. Yes. so that is the irritation of having this story. But what calms me, and I'm going to, this is my one question to John is about the humor that might make some of these paradoxes and contradictions and troubles. I guess I just tried to use that of saying, so did you do as much with humor in this book as you wanted to? And were you holding back sometimes and thinking the humor might actually make you seem, I mean, the consequentialness and the seriousness of the book are unmistakable. So was there more of a license for the humor of this? I think this is a silly story, but it's quite commonly told about how Gifford Pinchot was single at the time, and he had a housekeeper, and he would go on outings, Rock Creek Park, with President Roosevelt, and they would ford rivers or swim across creeks and rivers, and they would get cotton brambles. And one day when when Gifford Pinchot came back to his home, the housekeeper looked at him and he was a mess, and she said, "You've been with that president again, haven't you?" So, kind of I just wonder if there aren't ways in which we can make a better peace with these confusing founders if we laughed at them and laughed at ourselves at the same time. Then, rather seriously, I seem to be the only person preoccupied with the fact that many of the practices that we think of as conservation, the measured with restrained use of natural resources for the better preservation of values in that land, a lot of those originated with royalty and with aristocracy and with colonial governors going to distant places and having the naturalists say, "This is quite a wonderful place here. You should get the peasants out of here. You should get the local people out of here because they could really make a big mess of this." So that's a fact, I think, that many of the things that we call conservation originated in very top-down power, colonial governors, kings, lords, queens too, I shouldn't take them out of that. So what has been so wonderful about what has happened in North America and the figures that John so brightly puts the spotlight on, those people initiated an enormous ongoing experiment to see if conservation was compatible with democracy. And we don't know. we don't know. And yet, it came out a lot better than you might have expected if you think of those colonial, aristocratic, royal origins. So that's my the humor question. Oh, and then I just want to say I was so instructed and improved by your ideas about the merging and mingling of the missions, which for some reason I just hadn't happened to notice. I try to be an observant person, but that page I just thought, well, for heaven's sake. So thank you so much for that and many other parts as well. But if you would talk about this notion of the great experiment of democracy and conservation and its compatibility and how that actually, I think many passages in your book are going right at that. And then say a few words about the humor and experiences you might have had at Interior that were really funny.
Do you want me to respond now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we do. They're desperate to hear you respond. They're really eager. So,
Well, on the monarchy point, well, first of all, it's an ongoing experiment. It will go on as long as there are any public lands or as long as the country exists. So, you know, there's no ultimate outcome here, and things could change. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic, as I said in my talk, but things could change. This is a political process. They are political lands. You know, the libertarians used to sort of criticize the public lands scornfully as political lands, but I'm the first to admit they are political lands. They're subject to the political process. Congress could give them all away tomorrow if it wanted to. So that's one reason I think people who care about the lands need to make sure they engage fully in the political process. The monarchy question, you know, it ran through the 19th century. It runs through the public land debate today. There's a senator from Utah, Mike Lee, who is constantly talking about, you know, the public lands representing this sort of monarchical, you know, kick the common people out and lock it up as game preserves for the wealthy. But in the 19th century, as this movement was getting underway, I think the advocates for the movement were very careful to say, we're not recreating the monarchies of Europe with these public lands because they are going to be open to all. That was always a very pronounced thread of the public land. The movement to reserve public lands was, and they are going to be open to all. The very first time it happened in 1864, which I kind of argued in the book was really the world's first national park, if you get right down to it, because Congress said, it gave the lands to California, which is the valley to California, which is why it's not considered the world's first national park. But it told California in unmistakable terms in the legislation, these lands shall forever be kept in public ownership and shall be open to all. So that was a theme from the very beginning, and the idea that the common people, these are open spaces preserved for use by the common people and not just the aristocracy. And that was I think that distinction between that and the monarchical model in Europe was omnipresent, really. Now, humor. It's a really good question. You know, I wrestled a lot with how I didn't want to make it a really light book. It's probably really too heavy, but there's a little bit of humor now and again and all. You can always depend on Mark Twain. Mark Twain used to work for Senator Stewart, actually. He was a staff assistant till Stewart fired him. And he wrote a very funny piece, which I quote in the book, that ridiculed Stewart. And so you can always depend upon him. And there were other moments of humor as well. And I could tell you some humorous stories about my experience at the Interior Department. I did not put them in the book. I tried very carefully. This is not my life in public lands. This is a conventional political history. But funny things happen all the time because that's the political process. So maybe that's another book. I'll write a lighter one.
All right, well, thank you for that. Woo, this is loud. Yeah, I've got a loud mic. Anyhow, thank you so much for addressing climate change. I think it's one of the issues of many of us younger generations that are thinking about all the time, how it impacts us, our future generations, our children, and certainly how public lands, plays into that. Your book does a wonderful job kind of walking us through the history of public lands and how the use of public lands has changed with time. Fossil fuel extraction on public lands has become a lightning rod in modern political discourse. And today, if public lands were their own country, they would rank 5th in the world for greenhouse gas emissions. Do you see a future where public land use can play a leading role in finding answers to the climate solution?
Well, sure. I mean, as I mentioned, they are, in some respects, leading the transition. Now, I know the Biden administration has not ended all fossil fuel leasing on public lands and has been criticized for it. But frankly, I've been involved in the political process long enough to have a great sympathy for the position they find themselves in because, paper thin margins in the Congress and the public policy is really being controlled, frankly, by Joe Manchin, a fossil fuel senator from West Virginia. And that's a reality that the Biden administration has to deal with. But, if you contrast what happened in the Arctic refuge oil and gas leasing and the wind energy auction off Long Island a couple of months ago, this transition is well underway. I mean, the markets are speaking and will continue to speak. I think that the challenge for the Biden administration is to use the public lands as a symbol of that transition while navigating frankly, the political minefield they find themselves in. So I don't think they have the political room, particularly in advance of the 2022 election, to say, we're going to shut everything down. That position won't sell. But what they are trying to say, I think, is, okay, we're going to resume some oil and gas leasing on a very limited basis, and we're going to make them pay more. And so this is not business as usual. We are putting in place the beginnings of a transition, or we want to accelerate that transition. Now, they've got some very tough decisions ahead, by the way. I've been following fairly closely. There's a place in northwestern Alaska, west of the Arctic refuge, where ConocoPhillips has made a very large discovery of oil and gas. And they have leases already, issued, and they're seeking permits. This is called the Willow Project. And what the Biden administration is going through the evaluation process for this Willow project. It'll be teed up for a decision maybe the end of the year, something like that, early next year. That's going to be a real test because if they approve those permits, kind of unrestricted business as usual, there's 1 billion barrels of oil going to come out of that area. And that's not the transition I think we need from a standpoint of dealing with climate change over the long term. So they've got some challenges ahead, and watch this space. It'll be interesting to see how this unfolds.
Well, thank you. I think I'm next. Oh, also a loud mic. So I think, it's nice that you just brought up the Willow Project, because I think your book, for someone like me who, has spent my entire career so far in public land law, like in the trenches, in these battles, right? On the Willow Project, on Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which even though the lease sale was a bust, we have 2/3 of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge coastal plain under lease right now. And those leases remain in place and have not yet been canceled. And so we seem to have these unending fights over iconic places, many of which we thought were protected. I mean, roadless areas on the Tongass National Forest, sulfide ore copper mining in the headwaters of the Boundary Waters, our most visited wilderness area in the entire system. The list goes on. And so I think that reminder of taking the long view was really therapeutic for me. But, you know, you sort of layer on top, I think, the despair that many of us feel over how polarized our society is, the dysfunction of all three branches of our federal government, and then the urgency of not just the climate and biodiversity crisis, but also thinking about environmental justice impacts and who's at the table and who's really benefiting from public lands. And it feels pretty hopeless right now. But I also think looking at those disputes and those challenges as sort of data points along that longer arc was just a really good arc of history, was a really good reminder for me. And so I think my question for you is, you know, for those of us who are still deep in it doing this work and really committed to ensuring that that longer arc of, you know, moving the needle towards conservation, and I'd say meaningful conservation as well, and inclusive conservation. I mean, what's your advice for us? You know, you said like we got to get young people out and engaged in the political process, but you know, I'd like you to reflect on that a little bit more.
Well, sure. I mean, the advice is to keep fighting, keep advocating, you know, keep engaging. You know, the political process determines this stuff. So you really have to engage in the political process and make it work for you and try to convince people to do that. And, you know, optimistic or pessimistic, the line I've been using lately is, you know, the pessimist may be proved right in the end, but the optimist has more fun along the way. And that's kind of my personal, you know, sort of philosophy. So, and I think the larger arc of the story, I hope gives people optimism, you know, that you're part of a great enterprise here that is not over and frankly will never be over. The old friend of mine who does a lot of this public advocacy, public lands protection advocacy, always says is, you know, Satan never sleeps. I mean, no matter how much you lock something up, there'll always be somebody that wants to, you know, open it up for their own benefit. So you just have to keep at it. But it is a great, and I think from the big picture, 60,000-foot view, a great and successful enterprise that we should all take pride in. I mean, this is the political system working, and we should not forget that. That doesn't mean give up the pressure or stop engaging. Quite the opposite. But I hope that the ultimate message is that this is a large and glorious enterprise, and we should all continue to push that arc further.
Marty, assuming mine's gonna be loud. Oh, that actually sounds good. Yeah, so a couple of chapters in your book touched on the General Mining Law of 1872, which is coming up to its 150th anniversary. And I know that there's been talks of reform of the law that haven't been seen in 150 years. And something that's really pertinent right now is the push for uranium production domestically. And I know a lot of that touches on adjacent tribal lands. And you mentioned tribal co-management on our public lands. So I'm just kind of curious where you see the nexus of those conversations happening, of where you see the mining reform going, and as well as tribal co-management and tribal say, and kind of how that touches on the lands.
Okay, two somewhat distinct questions. I mean, in terms of the General Mining Law, you know, there's a reason it survived for 150 years. Grant signed it into law in 1872. You know, the industry has been very deft over the years in holding on to what they have. I mean, the public lands, I think I'm right in saying this, the America's public lands are the only place on the entire planet, only land on the entire planet where the owner of the minerals gets zip in terms of compensation or royalties or rent or payments for the extraction of those minerals. On state land, on private land, the owners, you know, get a cut, but not on the public lands. That's kind of an outrageous thing that has lasted this long. One of my great regrets in my career is we came very, very close in 1994 to negotiating a compromise, and it fell through at the last minute. And I remember thinking, well, that's all right, we'll fix it in the next Congress, you know, we'll push it across the finish line in the next Congress. And that was Gingrich, and the contract with America had something to say with that. And so that ended that. But where it goes from here, you know, I'm not holding my breath. And the issue you identify is actually a really interesting and important one, which is the whole transition to solar, wind, and, you know, more electronic wizardry to help solve the climate change problem is dependent upon a number of minerals that we don't have adequate supplies of. And so the industry is out there very vocally saying, we need to maintain the mining law of 1872 and open up more land, public lands to mining in order to get cobalt and rare earths and lithium and these other minerals that we need. Now, you know, the industry also says gold is a critical or strategic mineral, but it's almost all used for jewelry. So it's kind of a hard argument to make. Uranium is another. I mean, yeah, you need uranium for nuclear power plants, but you know, the world's biggest supplies of uranium are in, I think, Canada and Australia, and it's hard to imagine friendlier countries that, you know, to have supplies. So there's a lot of sort of misleading rhetoric around the critical and strategic mineral issue, but it does have political resonance. And believe me, every defender of the mining law is out there, you know, talking about critical and strategic minerals all the time. And how that plays out, that's another big challenge for the Biden administration, is to try to navigate through that. So I'm not holding my breath on mining law reform. On co-management, somewhat separate issue. Here, I guess this is where the kind of lawyer in me takes over. There's no standard definition of co-management. It's not defined in any federal law that I know of. And frankly, at bottom, nobody really knows what it means. It's a really nice slogan, and it's important to talk about, but the proof of the pudding is, what does it actually mean? I actually wrote some legal opinions on this in the 1990s when I was solicitor, because there is an existing federal law, it's been on the books since 1994, I think, which allows tribes to take over operations of federal programs under certain conditions, the Self-Governance Act. And we started wrestling with this problem back in the 1990s. What can you delegate to Native nations under the Self-Governance Act? And there's some really, really tricky questions here. For example, law enforcement. I mean, can you delegate the power to prosecute violations of law? Kind of wholly blank check to tribes. That's very complicated politically and legally to do that. So I think we'll clearly see more activity in this area, and more probably, if I had to predict, I would say there are probably going to be a whole bunch of kind of carefully negotiated deals about co-management or something like that on all kinds of different categories of federal land. But there's not sort of one size fits all solution here. And so I think we'll see a lot of activity, but I don't look for a kind of a revolution here, because the questions are really challenging, and the law is unsettled on lots of these issues.
I will finish things off. I'll try to be brief, because I know we're going to probably want to get to the audience. First of all, I just want to say thank you for writing the book. It's really phenomenal, and for a public lands nerd like myself, it's the book that I've kind of always wanted. So I really appreciate the work that was put into it. It's phenomenal. One thing, reading the book, one thing that's striking to me is you say at the beginning that this is a comprehensive political history of the public lands, and it absolutely is. But it's also a pretty comprehensive political history of the United States. Public lands and the United States have been pretty intimately married, and it's pretty remarkable to see how closely tied those two stories are. I want to ask one question that hopefully ties a couple of these threads together. So, one of the things we learned in law school, and I'm uncomfortable a little bit because I'm looking at two of my professors right here, and maybe some more watching online. We talk about how we had big public land laws, in the long ago, and then we had a big push for environmental legislation in the 60s and 70s, and then since then it's been pretty quiet and not much has happened. And I'm curious because one of the threads in the book is that when you have some big, sometimes when you have a big, environmental issue that comes to public light, like flooding just before the Weeks Act, or the Dust Bowl just before the Taylor Grazing Act, you get public opinion to a point where there's the political will to enact big sweeping public land laws. And I'm curious if you think that climate change and the effects of climate change might open a window for new big sweeping public lands legislation, or do you think we're kind of at an end of the big new management packages?
Very good question. The jury's still out on that. Obviously, as the evidence mounts, I think to most average Americans about climate change being a reality and the threats that it poses, you know, we keep hoping for the sort of crisis moment that's going to lead to some major solutions, but instead we're kind of inching along. Is it ever going to get to that big break? I don't know, because of the nature of the problem and the fact that it's so complicated. I wouldn't bet on it. On the other hand, I do think there are things that could well happen. I've talked about this in other contexts. The climate effect on water supplies, and a lot of stuff written, for example, about the Colorado River and the shrinking Colorado River and what that's going to do to a significant part of the West. I think we may be heading for one of those big cultural shifts in this respect. By far the biggest user of water in the Colorado River today is irrigated alfalfa, used for cows. And as the water supply shrinks, we're going to be heading for a somewhat Dust Bowl-like episode, I think, which may involve a significant shift in public policy vis-a-vis livestock grazing on hot deserts. Now, not livestock grazing on all public lands, because it's, I think, perfectly suitable in a lot of places, but in the hot, arid deserts, you know, it's going to come under a lot of stress, in part because of this water supply and shrinking problem. And so that may be an example where we're going to see something like that. Climate related, to be sure. Whether we're going to see a big opportunity in terms of accelerating the shift away from fossil fuels, I don't know. I mean, I hope so, believe me, because I think, you know, catastrophe sort of lurks if we don't get a handle on this in a big way soon. And that's what all the science is telling us. But whether the political system is going to be able to respond to that, I don't know. I hope so, but I wouldn't predict.
Millions of tons of that.
It's Saudi Arabia too.
China, yeah. So it's a really interesting political issue, I think.
Yes, it is.
Charles, I want to give you a chance to say a few words if you'd like, ask a question if you'd like, before we open up to the audience.
The questions too, and I'll just say very quickly that I thought Allison Flint really raised an important question about there are these big issues and young people just kind of what do they do? And I just want to say personally, and I know that there are a lot of people in this room who can think of this kind of person. A lot of work on public lands has been with one person or two or three people who saw something they didn't like. And they went out and they tried to stop it, or they tried to get the land protected, and it's extremely satisfying. And it is something that and because John has emphasized this, how much local sentiment is important. And so that's an opportunity for people to get in and just do one maybe, and they'll remember it all their lives.
Okay, Sean, are you ready with the microphone? Do we have a question from the audience? We like to ask our first question, have a student ask the first question. Do we still have a few students in the back, maybe? They may have abandoned. Oh, no, there, I see them. They're here. Luke, Jake, come on, guys. You can. Cameron? No?
We stun them into silence, I think.
There you go, that'll work.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, one thing that's been sort of increasingly talked about in hunting communities is landlocked public lands that can't be accessed from other public lands and rights of way. And someone who's not from a law background, I was wondering what pathways might the U.S. government have in providing access to those lands, and what might be some great solutions to start opening public access to those landlocked public lands.
There's a lot of emphasis being put on this now in the last couple of years in particular. And this is an issue, by the way, that I think is bipartisan, unites people across the political spectrum. Because the idea that you've got these public lands that provide these rich opportunities, but you can't get to them because the private landowners surrounding the access points won't give access, Their position is not a popular position. And government, state, local, and national are responding to this. And there are ways to do it. I mean, the ultimate, you can simply condemn. You can condemn a right-of-way. You know, the government can, just like they condemn rights-of-way for freeways and transmission lines and everything else, you can condemn an easement across somebody's private land, even if they're unwilling, because of the government's power of eminent domain. Now, the government does not like to do that, because it's kind of a flashpoint and you know, causes controversy. But they have that's the ultimate power that they have. What they're going to do instead, I think, in lots of places, is to buy from willing sellers, do land exchanges. There are all kinds of ways to solve the access problem in these landlocked areas. And Congress is beginning to throw a significant amount of money at that. In fact, the two bills I mentioned that Trump signed into law, I think the 2020 bill actually has some specific provisions about directing the agencies to go out and identify where these access problems are and to come up with a plan to deal with them. So this is something that is really attracting a lot of attention, has pretty broad support. And, you know, until say 5 years ago, I don't think people really understood how big a problem it was, but there's been some fairly careful inventories that show, if I remember right, something like 7 or 8 million acres of public lands actually don't have access for recreational purposes. My guess is that problem is going to be substantially diminished by these efforts that are now underway. I'm pretty hopeful about that.
There's a big controversy over this right now in Wyoming at the corner crossing issue. And I'm just, since you were a former solicitor, John, I mean, is that something you think you could address through a solicitor's opinion to some extent?
You know, it's very complicated. And the law on this is somewhat unclear.
You've got the Leo Sheep case.
The Leo Sheep case, you know, from 1980, which basically said the United States does not have access across private corners in a checkerboard situation. But state law comes into play here to some extent, and that's what's being litigated, I think, in the Wyoming case. But ultimately, frankly, I don't think litigation is going to solve that problem by itself. I think it'll be solved by acquisitions, exchanges, and other kind of you know, sort of friendlier mechanisms.
Another question. There we go in the back, Sean.
Thanks, Professor Leshy, Solicitor Leshy. Nice to hear from you today. I'm always inspired sitting here listening to your thinking, so appreciate that. I wanted to just follow up on the question on next big legislation that could be possible. I mean, it seems to me that fires on public lands and fires in all our Western communities should be able to help drive significant change. And we certainly have experienced that, you know, here. More recently, we had a fire, yesterday, and then 2 days before that, and then we had the Marshall Fire in the middle of winter. So, and we know that California faces similar fires, as does the rest of the West. So just curious on thoughts about that.
Yeah, it is a tremendously complicated problem, I think. I mean, the solutions are not always readily apparent. I mean, you know, somebody said, and I thought this made a lot of sense, that the problem is not, we don't have a fire problem, we've got a inappropriate building problem. You know, we've got a location of dwellings, because all the firefighting is about protecting dwellings on private property. I mean, not that we shouldn't do that, but you know, and you have the federal government bearing the primary responsibility in most places to fight the fires, but the federal government doesn't have really any significant control over where people build, because that's a matter of state and local land use law. And in many parts of the West, there isn't much local land use law. I think that's changing a fair amount. I mean, an enormous amount of attention being given to this now. The insurance companies are finally sort of waking up to the scope of the problem, and they're going to weigh in, and that's going to have some interesting, that'll have some clout. You know, I don't think there's a single solution. It's you know, as some of the fires like around here have shown, it's not simply a public lands problem. It's not simply a forest problem. It's a generic problem for everybody. And you know, these fires are a scourge, but they can appear everywhere, and you can have the best public land policies in the world, and that's not going to eliminate this problem, because it's related to the climate generally and the drying out generally. So It is horrendously complex. Good news is an awful lot of attention that's being paid to it now because people have obviously woken up to the fact that this is a big problem. And the federal government is beginning to put some significant dollars into addressing the problem. The Forest Service, I think, just got $1 billion with a B to address the sort of thinning problem and the fire control problem. And but it's really complicated. Somebody asked me the other day, what was one of your darkest days as solicitor when I worked at the Interior Department? One of the darkest days was when the National Park Service back in 1999, I think, or 2000, lit a controlled burn in the Bandelier National Monument. And over the course of the next 3 days, they made like 17 wrong decisions. They came to forks in the road and made the wrong decision every time and burned down 250 houses in Los Alamos, New Mexico. That was a dark morning when, you know, you had a federal control burn down 250 houses. The outcome actually, it was an interesting episode because Senator Domenici of New Mexico, Republican, very powerful guy, he stepped in and quickly negotiated a compensation bill and all of that. And so it all sort of came out fine in the end. I don't think anybody was killed, happily. But one of the lessons was, if that had happened in certain parts of the West, like Idaho or maybe Utah, it would have been like a revolution. But Los Alamos is one of the most educated communities in the country. I mean, it's PhD scientists, basically. Many people live there. They understood that, you know, mistakes happen, government can do stupid things, control burns get out of control and all of that. So it was actually an episode politically that it was sort of handled quickly and didn't turn into a big, you know, problem. But it was certainly, that was a tough press release to write, you know. It's a control burn burns down 250 houses. So
We have a question from the audience, from the online audience, and that I'll ask. It's from somebody from Wild Earth Guardians, it looks like. So let me just read it to you, John. And it's something you've tangentially addressed a moment ago about oil and gas leasing. So the comment is, great panel tonight. Thanks to everyone. Why is the Biden administration continuing to pursue onshore oil and gas leasing? The Interior Department continues to cite a District of Louisiana ruling regarding leasing, but fundamentally, the Secretary has ultimate discretion to decide whether and to what extent to lease. With a number of court rulings rejecting oil and gas leasing for violating NEPA or other laws, why is the administration deferring to this aberrant Louisiana decision? I'm just reading the question, John.
Well, for one thing, I think the aberrant Louisiana decision enjoined the department. Now, you don't actually, you know, violate an injunction with, you know, there are certain penalties that go with that. The law, in fact, is a kind of a mess here. And the litigation that's ongoing is actually kind of interesting. And one thing that hasn't gotten enough play is that a bunch of conservative Republican attorneys general have brought a lawsuit to challenge the Biden administration's calculation of the social cost of carbon as in terms of their decision-making for any kind of fossil fuel related things. And they are seeking and have won an injunction against all decision-making. They have shut down the federal government on this point, and the Biden administration, and not just on fossil fuel leasing, but on everything else. The Biden administration went in and got relief from this, and the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals lifted the injunction the district court had entered. And the Republican attorneys general have now marched into the Supreme Court to reinstate the injunction. Now, it totally baffles me how these Republican attorney generals can complain about the federal government shutting down all oil and gas leasing when they're in court actually arguing for that result while they fix this problem. So there's an awful lot of, legally, it's kind of a mess. Now, what the Biden administration has done, as I said, they have a political problem here. And the Ukraine situation, frankly, complicates it even more because of the emphasis on oil and gas, et cetera. So I have a lot of sympathy for the dilemma they're in. And the simple answer of shutting everything down, saying we are not going to issue a new permit, we are not going to issue any new leases anywhere, and we're going to go down and shut down existing operations on you know, valid leases and valid permits on federal land is an unacceptable step politically. I think they are trying to feel their way along to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. But I think we have to recognize that they're in a very tough place. Like I said, Joe Manchin is the controlling vote in the Senate, and we know what he thinks about this stuff, and they have to deal with that reality.
I have another question from online, but I also have one comment myself. Can you, so I know that they also raised the royalties to like 18.5%. I'm assuming that's a pretty big deal, and I don't know when the last time it was raised.
Never. It's never been raised. And that's a signal they're trying to send, okay, we're going to do a limited amount of new leasing, but it's not business as usual. We're going to raise the royalty rate by 50%. Interestingly enough, the oil industry, of course, complains bloody murder about their raising the royalty rate, but they pay when they lease on state lands that royalty, at least, if not more, when they lease in Texas or Louisiana or New Mexico or wherever. So the royalty issue is kind of a smokescreen here. But I'm glad they're doing it. I mean, it really, the royalty rate has not been raised on oil and gas leases since 1920, even though the statute says, and has said since 1920, not less than 12.75 or whatever the percentage is.
John, could you clarify something about this oil and gas leasing situation, the Louisiana opinion? I've been getting a lot of questions about this. And as I read the Mineral Leasing Act, the onshore law, it says, I think, something to the effect that BLM has to hold quarterly lease sales in any state where there are lands eligible for leasing. And under land use plans, there are a lot of lands that are made eligible, I would argue. And so the Louisiana court has something to support its position on that. And I guess my position has been, that doesn't say how much land you could lease. You could lease a very modest amount of land. So am I reading that right?
No, I think you're reading right. And this is part of the ambiguity that's leading to all the litigation controversies and stuff. You're exactly right. The statute says the secretary has complete discretion to lease or not lease, but must hold quarterly lease sales where there are lands eligible for leasing, and nobody's ever interpreted that. I mean, until nobody knows what that meant. Does that mean eligible under land use plans or eligible? Could the secretary issue a blanket order that said no lands are eligible for leasing until we go through a formal, further analysis or something like that? Possible. We just don't know. This is something that's never been tested. That eligible for leasing, by the way, came in the law in 1987, and it's never been interpreted until recently, never been raised until recently. So, and before that, from 1920 and 1987, the law is absolutely clear. There's a Supreme Court unanimous decision on this in 1930 that says the secretary has complete discretion not to lease. So.
Go ahead.
I have one more question from online. Do you think there's more utility in focusing on protecting additional lands in the lower 48 or additional lands in Alaska, or a balance? What role do you see urban access to wilderness and national public awareness to access to wilderness playing a part in where and what is protected?
I didn't get the last part of the question, but I'll answer the first, then you can ask again. The Alaska versus the rest of the country. Politically, it's hard. One of the things Alaska has going for it in terms of its pro-fossil fuel development policy is they're tremendously dependent upon fossil fuels, and their senior senator, Lisa Murkowski, is very able and very respected, and the Biden administration needs her votes on certain things. So that's a political reality they have to deal with, just like they have to deal with Joe Manchin. And they will muddle through.
I think the second part was, when you think about that balance, should we think about national awareness and how important that is? So to have protected lands closer to urban areas so there's more access.
Oh yeah, and I think that's also happening too. One of the modern developments, that I talked about starting in the 1960s was putting more public lands, acquiring more public lands in major urban areas. I mean, that's where the Gateway National Recreation Area in New York City came about, and the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area in the LA Basin, all came about. So, and national seashores do the same thing, and national lake shores and all of that. So that's been a big emphasis, is putting parks closer to the people is for the idea, but any kind of public lands.
Any other?
We're going to give Jake the last question here, I think. Our new Wisco.
Thank you. And thank you for talking to us, trying to make my professor proud here. As a former solicitor, to what extent do you think this further answer, this, if I can call it a fight for public lands and for protection of public lands, will be done by interpreting existing legal tools or reinterpreting existing law? And to what extent should we think of this as a push for new law or a political battle?
It will inevitably be both. I will say one thing, though, that I haven't said before, at least to this audience. When you talk about either interpreting existing law or reinterpreting existing law, or doing the first interpretations of a new law, ultimately, almost all of those questions are going to end up in court. Now, when you look at the long history of public lands, I think it's fair to say, and I'm trying to be nonpartisan here, but I think it's fair to say that the federal courts have been pretty friendly overall, from the district courts up to the Supreme Court, pretty friendly to the general idea that public lands protection is a good thing. They've been supportive, and they've supported interpretations that advance that notion. In fact, I spend some time in the book. I don't talk very much about court decisions, but every time there's kind of a significant Supreme Court decision, I quote it and to show the attitude of the Supreme Court at these points in time. That is going to change. I have little doubt that the federal court system is going to turn quite hostile, starting at the top, to public lands. Because it's been stacked by, frankly, by, sort of Federalist Society. Mitch McConnell has won that battle. So we're already seeing, we're seeing quite conservative statutory construction involving things like public land protection. There's a very bad decision from my perspective came out of Alaska, out of the Ninth Circuit just a couple of weeks ago on this point. And so I think that's going to be a sea change in terms of how all this plays out in the next 20 years or so. Now, how it plays out, I'm not sure. Many of you are aware, for example, that Chief Justice Roberts issued a very, very puzzling memorandum in a Supreme Court case last year, in which he sort of cast doubt on the broad interpretation of the Antiquities Act to create national monuments, presidential power, that had been in place since 1906, that the Supreme Court had unanimously affirmed in 1920. And he writes this puzzling memorandum. It says, gee, there's some really interesting questions here, and maybe the Antiquities Act has been really interpreted very badly, or it doesn't mean how it's been applied. He didn't even cite the case, the unanimous case in 1920. So a lot of people have taken that as kind of an indicator that the federal courts are really going to be much more hostile than they used to be, and that's a new element, and that argues again for more political activism to make the laws so clear that the courts can't, interpret them out of existence.
But in keeping with your message for tonight, we're going to take the long view, John, and we're going to think that we may not live to see it, but hopefully we will, over time, see a different Supreme Court that will continue to uphold.
Well, it can be enlarged tomorrow. Remember that.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I think we're going to close it there. Let's thank our panel and thank John in particular for a wonderful